Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, we'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console are multiple application widgets you can use. To explain each widget, please click on the maximize icon at the top right of the widget, or you can drag the bottom right corner of the widget panel. Additional resources are available in the resource list widget, indicated by the green file at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your questions. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, but you can submit any questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait to the very end. If you have technical difficulties, please click on the help widget. There's a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command R on Macs to refresh your player console. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast will be available one day after the webcast using the same audience link used to join today's event. At the end of the event, please fill out the survey, and when you're done, press submit. Now I'd like to introduce Amy Johnson. Amy, you have the floor.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar titled Culturally Responsive Pedagogy in Educator Preparation Programs. Today's webinar is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education's Mid-Atlantic Regional Education Lab, and I'm Amy Johnson from Mathematica Policy Research, which leads the work for this regional education lab. This is the final webinar in our four-part series. Our goal for the series has been that it will prompt audience members, either individually or ideally with a team of your colleagues, to put what you hear into action in one way or another. We think of this webinar series as a workshop to provide you with valuable guidance on how to create more equitable education environments that include culturally responsive practices. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to point audience members to an action plan that you all should have received electronically via email. The action plan is intended to be a starting point for the critical conversations and strategic planning that we hope each of you and your colleagues will begin in working toward culturally responsive pedagogy. Feel free to jot down thoughts, ideas, or questions related to the prompts in the action plan throughout the webinar. But most of all, please take this with you after today's session is over and take action. Please do something with the information you hear today and what you have heard throughout the series. Our speaker today is Dr. Conra Gist. Dr. Gist is an Associate Professor of Teaching and Teacher Education at the University of Houston. Thank you, Dr. Gist, for joining us, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. It really is a privilege to be able to present today on culturally responsive pedagogy and educator preparation programs. When I was kind of preparing to give this talk, I was remembering that it was really almost 10 years ago when I first did my initial dissertation work, really trying to understand what were some of the core dimensions of culturally responsive pedagogy. And it's really just an honor and a treat to be able to talk about some of that research today. Just really quickly before I get started, I wanted to make sure that I kind of give an overview of how we come to kind of explore this topic of culturally responsive educator preparation. And really kind of the previous presentations really sort of talk very specifically about the nuts and bolts of the framework and sort of how it shows up in schools. But really, the reason we're sort of talking about it as it relates to culturally responsive educator preparation is really kind of the tension between these two ideas of thinking about teacher effectiveness and teacher retention. In particular, thinking about this notion that culturally responsive educators are more likely to be effective with the students that they work with, and not only in the context of academic outcomes, but also non-academic factors that are associated with absenteeism, participation in after school, kind of the kinds of factors that really make a difference in terms of whether or not students actually show up and are truly engaged. This notion of culturally responsive pedagogy is also very much connected to retention, the ability of teachers to be able to kind of connect with students and to be effective in the classroom impacts whether or not they actually decide to stay in the profession, in the schools that they originally were placed, or make a determination to move on to schools that may be a better fit for their disposition and background. And so this brings us to the idea of thinking about the ways in which culturally responsive educator preparation programs are designed in such a way to reach and teach all students. Really, it's just sort of really taking the time to understand the ways in which our programs equip teachers to do that or don't do that work. And though the importance of that work is clear, there are certain design challenges that really kind of complicate that work. And what I'd like to talk through today are some of the research-based strategies to develop culturally responsive teachers. And so the questions that we'll be focusing on, the guiding questions for this session, are how are programs preparing future teachers to understand and effectively support culturally responsive pedagogy? What are the core implementation considerations to address? And then finally, what do current programs consider to be most effective in preparing future educators to deliver culturally responsive pedagogy? And so in thinking about this work, I thought it was really important to make sure that we anchor this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy and educator preparation around kind of two core frameworks of approaching this work. They're not the only frameworks, but to me, they're really important in terms of anchoring our understanding. The first is a seminal scholarship published by Ana Maria Viegas and Tamara Lucas, and I call it seminal because it's been around for some time out of Montclair State University, but it's really important because what they do is they move beyond just sort of a theoretical definition of what CRP may look like in schools to thinking very specifically about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that teacher candidates must be able to exhibit by the time they graduate from our programs in order to truly be culturally responsive. And so they break this down based on 6 core facets. The first of which is thinking about the importance of sociocultural political consciousness. Really sort of thinking about the ways in which we have students interrogate, the intersection, for example, between race, power, and privilege. This notion that students really have to be critically aware of what's happening in their environment and to be able to look at it from multiple critical lenses and perspectives. And so part of the work in terms of our preparation of these teachers is to make sure that we're cultivating that type of consciousness. The second piece around this work is really thinking about this idea of affirming attitudes towards diversity. And this, just to clarify, as I'm sure some of the previous presenters have alluded to, moves beyond just a simple affirmation to kind of have a cultural celebration day and really sort of thinks about how we can use this notion of affirmation of diversity to reimagine the type of curriculum that we're actually offering to students, and to also think about the implications for shifting practices school-wide. And so, James Banks is commonly referred to as the godfather of multicultural education. And one of the things that I think he does really well when talking about diversity is to really sort of think about this affirmation as something that kind of extends beyond the curriculum to really sort of penetrating, like reimagining the school structures that are currently in place. So that directly connects to this third point in terms of thinking about acting as a change agent. And I will say that even, in 2019, this is still kind of a contentious point in some ways, unfortunately. And it's this notion that we are intentionally impairing our teachers to be change agents. And it's not just about sort of the content knowledge, but it's really about making sure that they're kind of prepared to enact some of those changes to sort of challenge taken for granted school practices that may be disproportionately impacting certain groups of students. So that sort of part of the work is asking those difficult questions and advocating and being on the front line for change. This is directly connected also to the idea of thinking about constructive approaches in terms of the ways in which teachers think about working with students. And it's it's beyond like the kind of basic level of just saying that we're sort of, using prior knowledge to kind of deepen students' content connection with the content that we're teaching, to really sort of thinking about reimagining the knowledge systems that are actually valued in our curriculum and making sure that there kind of are diverse perspectives in which they can actually draw from. And I think it's also important to mention here is when we're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy, also kind of bearing in mind some of Django Paris's work around this notion of culturally sustaining pedagogy too, so that it's not just about the sort of integration of these kind of cultural knowledge systems without any kind of critical kind of perspective or pushback. And an example of that would be in terms of constructivist approaches, is thinking about the ways in which we kind of teachers may be interested incorporating hip-hop in the classroom as a way to kind of ignite engagement with students. And so on the one hand, we say, great, that's excellent work in terms of thinking about constructivist approaches. But one of the things that I would kind of push on here in terms of how we would engage teachers is also kind of at the same time teaching them to kind of critique any kind of sexist or homophobic lyrics that may be kind of present within that particular cultural resource as well. And what Django Paris actually does in talking about this idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy is just to say that culture isn't reified. It's not this kind of firm thing that isn't nimble, that that's without critique, that doesn't kind of change and become fluid over time. And so I think the ways in which that we engage students to construct connections with students, to build on their knowledge, also has to create room for critique. That also connects to the next point around learning about students, families, and communities. So making sure that part of our work in the context of the program is giving them an opportunity to be grounded in the context of the community. And I'll say a little bit about that later. And then finally, the last dimension is thinking about cultivating culturally responsive practices, which is really looking at how to kind of integrate all of these principles into the future culturally responsive teacher. So I start off here just for two reasons. One, so that it's really clear that aside from kind of all the theoretical frameworks around CRP, is that we can be really intentional about defining what culturally responsive pedagogy is for our teacher candidates. And this is one example of a framework that does that work. Not only does it do kind of that work in terms of some of the core kind of attributes, but in the context of the book for each of the dimensions, it also kind of tries to, on a continuum, give a brief description of what that would look like in practice and also what it would not look like across these different facets. So that's kind of the first point. And the second point that they kind of make with this text is that all of these different features of CRP should actually be integrated throughout the entire teacher education curriculum. It's not necessarily the work of one multicultural education classroom to do this work, but what they sort of argue and provide an example for towards the end of their text is thinking about how systematically we can interrogate the coursework that we have our students take from entry to graduation and look at points in which we're actually emphasizing and giving opportunity for students to develop, to deepen their knowledge and skills across these different areas. This is the first framework that I wanted to kind of open with. The second one is thinking about this idea of the culturally efficacious educator. And this comes from the work of Dr. Belinda Bustos Flores from the University of Texas, San Antonio. And I think that this is really interesting because she pushes the notion of culturally responsive, relevant teaching to really think about it as this kind of culturally efficacious practice as what teachers are actually able to realize and enact in their work with students. It's not just something that they're writing a reflection about, it's something that they're actually doing and enacting in some way. And so it's an important principle because she didn't just kind of come up with this idea and say that it was relevant, but she used it as a framework for the educator preparation program. And so I think this is a really important point because if you look at the 5 areas listed on the left side of the screen, she really sort of sees the teacher's consciousness kind of developing and evolving over time, and that this is something that's being nurtured throughout the entire educator preparation program. So building on what I shared in the previous slide, if you sort of have this kind of critical perspective anchoring the program, then that's sort of what you're actually using to drive all of the experiences that happen in the context of the teacher's preparation. Now, what I think is really interesting about her work is that basically, she takes this kind of general framework of thinking about sort of how teachers develop and become efficacious over time. And I think logically you should be able to see kind of the flow here, right, in terms of thinking about the awakening cultural consciousness, so the kinds of activities that allow students to become woke to critical perspectives, so to speak. And so this in teacher ed often, involves activities that are very much about kind of personal identity and reflection and sort of trying to understand how they come to this work of thinking about being an educator. So activities that are very much about kind of inside me and reflection. And then moving to the acquiring cultural competence is really thinking about kind of exploring more deeply how this actually intersects with different power relations and dynamics that are actually happening, right? So it's not just sort of this personal reflection, but sort of really sort of looking at the intersection between power and privilege, how it's actually influenced how they sort of were educated, and how that's also influencing the way that they see teaching and learning. And then over time, the second half of the continuum is really about looking to develop that proficiency over time to the point in which it becomes actualized. Now, on the right-hand side, what you'll see there is it says culturally efficacious evolution model. And so what Dr. Flores did and her team is to take the concept of culturally efficacious dimensions, you'll see them in the outer circle, and on the inner circle, they begin to sort of identify elements of each one of these dimensions, right? So for example, awakening cultural consciousness is connected to dimensions of developing consciousness, understanding ethnic identity development. Acquiring cultural competence is connected to social interactions and interpersonal relationships. Developing cultural proficiency is connected to creating conditions for language learning, expanding knowledge acquisition. And then finally, actualizing cultural and critical responsivity is connected to critical reasoning skills, advancing self-regulated learning, encouraging students' self-evaluation, and then realizing the cultural efficaciousness is really about actualizing ethical and enduring professional responsibilities. And so these are all kind of elements of the culturally efficacious model. Now, what I think is really interesting is that they took this particular framework and then converted it into an observation protocol. And so what I think, why this is really important is it's really about thinking about how do these ideas come to life in praxis. So in this case, they had the framework that really anchored their program. They thought about how they would actually operationalize it with kind of very clear kind of elements for each one of the dimensions. And then they developed this observation protocol, which actually lists out not only the elements, but the kinds of teacher behaviors that would show up and student behaviors that would actually show up. And this protocol is actually used by the mentor teachers from the university side of the work, and it's also utilized by the school-based teachers who are also supporting teachers. And so it becomes this kind of anchoring tool that the teachers are able to use to really think about how they are or not enacting culturally efficacious practices. Okay, so with that in mind, in terms of thinking about the key frameworks that you might kind of imagine that would anchor a program, the next thing that I want to spend some time talking about are the core implementation components for culturally responsive pedagogy. And so this actually comes from an article that my colleagues and I worked on, and it's an encyclopedia of teacher education, and it's just simply titled Culturally Responsive Teacher Education. And essentially what we argue is that if you sort of want to think about implementing culturally responsive preparation in your program, it roughly involves these four components. One is program structure, the second, curriculum and pedagogical practice, the third, interrogating belief systems and dispositions, and then finally, the teacher educators. So first off, in terms of thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy in the program structure, there are several factors to keep in mind. The first is thinking about how the admission and selection criteria actually encourages teacher candidates and faculty who have disposition towards critical sociocultural consciousness to be engaged with your program. And so what I mean by that is if a program says that they value culturally responsive pedagogy, which includes some of the aspects that I mentioned in the very first slide, how does that show up in some of the selection criteria for admittance into the program? If there's a valuing of socio-cultural political consciousness, where does that show up in the selection process for teacher candidates? Also in the context of faculty as well. So, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but if we sort of want to make sure that our programs are embodying a type of socio-political cultural consciousness, then a lot of that comes from the teacher educators who engaged in that work. So when we think about faculty that we're onboarding in terms of our structure, where is there a place for really valuing that work? Right. The other thing is thinking about this idea of cultural responsivity to teacher candidates, right? How do we address this teacher diversity issue? And so in terms of the program structure, it's also who the structure is designed to support. So if we think about this idea of wanting to diversify the educator workforce, not to say that the teacher candidates that we have are not necessarily who we want, but we want to broaden the field. We want to sort of open it to other people who don't currently have access. What is it about our program structure that could be more responsive? For example, if we have folks who are working full time and need to take night classes, is our structure going to be more responsive to be able to meet them at certain times of the day? Or, for example, there's a program out in California. It's called the California Mini Corps program, and its program is specifically designed to recruit children of migrant workers or children who come from migrant communities. And the idea is that because they know that they're recruiting these students, they go in and intentionally recruit them in high schools where we know that they're going to be in high numbers. They make sure that the teacher candidates who are part of the program are serving in those particular schools, so their placements are intentionally positioned there. And they also have support structures that give them financial support, flexible admission structures. So we know that some of them may come from academic backgrounds that weren't very supportive, so they give them extra tutoring supports to make sure that they're actually able to enter into the program. And then finally, there's an agreement to make sure that those same students are actually placed back in either the same school or similar schools within that district. And so there was a lot of shifting that had to happen in the context of the educator preparation program to be responsive to this particular group of students. And so in sum, this notion of thinking about program structure and the kinds of things that need to be addressed in ways that will recruit people who wouldn't typically have access or value critical dispositions is really important. And it's not just a kind of 1-2 process, but there are multiple things to consider at that level. And then the second point is thinking about it as it relates to curriculum and pedagogical practices. So one of the things that you see repeatedly in the literature around kind of thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy in ed prep is this notion that it only takes place in the context of one course. So I talked about that in the very opening slide in terms of thinking about how this is actually integrated throughout the entire teacher ed curriculum, right? So as a kind of first step, it's thinking about kind of what are the curriculum mapping activities that need to take place to see where are you currently? Is there a real valuing around this idea of thinking about preparing culturally responsive teachers? And what is it that we need to do differently in terms of the kinds of learning opportunities that students actually have access to? One of the ways that teacher educators think about preparing teachers to be more culturally responsive as it relates to curriculum and pedagogical practices is to make sure that their students have learning experiences that are actually embedded in the community. So some of the work that Dr. Zygmunt has been doing out of Ball State University is really interesting because their whole teacher education program in terms of the curriculum and pedagogical practices is sort of rooted and grounded in the concept of the community teacher. And so the learning experiences are about having service learning partnerships with community-based organizations, making sure that the methods courses are actually taking place in the context of schools or in the partnership with other school leaders, right? So a way to really sort of think about this beyond just thinking about mapping, are we doing the work, is also thinking about where the curriculum and pedagogical practices actually take place, and are they happening in kind of collaboration and partnership and solidarity with communities. The other point is thinking about this notion of interrogating belief systems and dispositions, and this is really huge because at the end of the day, we're still talking about culturally responsive educator preparation program because equity issues remain an issue in our society, right? That we still cannot guarantee yet that all students will have access to equitable educational experiences. And so one of the ways in which we kind of challenge that as being the continual narrative is taking teachers and program leaders for that matter through the process of interrogating belief systems and dispositions. So at the most basic level, that involves thinking about the kind of critical questions and critical reflection opportunities that we're actually designing for teacher candidates. So when I say basic, what I mean by that is kind of always kind of interrogating and asking questions about whose voices are missing or not added to the conversation, whose knowledge is actually being valued and centered, where are the perspectives and backgrounds of communities of color around this particular work. And then more fundamentally, asking the question about whether or not, as it relates to our educator preparation programs, the sequence of learning activities that we're designing for them give them an opportunity to actually interrogate belief systems and dispositions. So one of the, kind of a concrete example of taking up this work in the context of teacher education is giving students an opportunity to do critical ethnography work, for example, or engage in some type of critical inquiry project that's really kind of unpacking and sort of understanding the school, neighborhood, community. And not just from, I mean, clearly, I guess I should just say, not from a deficit perspective, but from a community cultural wealth perspective, right? And so they're thinking about what it means to engage in community mapping practices that allow students to be able to see resources, to be able to see genius and possibility in the students that they're going to be serving by doing a kind of critical investigation of what's happening in the context of that particular community. And designing a set of critical questions that at last, that require them to face, kind of hard questions around race, power, privilege. Why is it the case that this particular school community has this set of academic results? What is it about, like, the context that is helping to kind of push and shape this? And then also, what are the strength-based positive assets that are available within this community to challenge this kind of negative narrative around academic achievement? And so the main kind of point with this is making sure that students are prepared with a critical mindset in general, and then in particular thinking about the set of instructional opportunities and assignments that we give them to take up that work. Now that is directly connected to the next point, which is focused very specifically on the teacher educators. And this is important because basically the first 3 points that I just talked about in terms of the program structure, curriculum, pedagogical practices, interrogating belief systems, and dispositions really hang on the practices and commitments of teacher educators to engage in this work, to take it up, to lead, to be vulnerable in ways that may be challenging for them. And there are several different factors that kind of complicate this work in some ways. So, part of it is just thinking about the ethno-racial diversity of teacher educators in general. So if you think about us having kind of a national kind of pipeline issue in terms of ethno-racial representation, that also kind of carries over in terms of teacher educator representation. And so there's a sort of tension between sort of how is it that we might sort of engage teacher educators that may not necessarily have these kinds of commitments, recognizing that if we don't do that work, then our students may not get the preparation that they actually need. The other thing that I think is really important here is also expanding our notion of how we think about or define the teacher educator. So in the example that I just gave, it's really sort of thinking about the university-based teacher educator. But I think part of what culturally responsive educator preparation pushes us to do is to expand beyond thinking about the teacher educator is just based in the university, but also think about school-based teacher educators who are fundamental to the teaching and learning experiences of teacher candidates in our programs. And also thinking about the role of community-based teacher educators. An example of a community-based educator, one of my other research interests is looking at how we develop Grow Your Own programs. And a program that I studied when I first started doing the work was out of Grow Your Own, Illinois. And one of the reasons I was captivated by that program at the time is because part of their preparation work for folks who are, invited to join this program was that they were actually placed in school community neighborhoods. So these were schools or neighborhoods where they were likely to teach, and also best case scenario where they actually lived. And so they were in these neighborhood communities, and they were connected to a community-based organization. And there was a leader at that CBO who was in charge of conducting these weekly teacher candidate sessions. And what they would do is they would sort of come together, talk about kind of key issues that were taking place that were community specific, not just in the context of the school, but these kind of neighborhood issues that were sort of impacting the lives of students whenever they showed up in the classroom. And so it really, for me, and having an opportunity to go and to observe some of those meetings, shifted the role of just sort of thinking about teacher education as living in the context of the university teacher educator, to thinking about how community teacher educators play a role in this work too. And so in thinking about culturally responsive preparation around teacher educators, it's really expanding the definition of who that educator is. And so I think that unfortunately, the challenges are well known in terms of, and I'll just run through them quickly and give a couple of examples. First is sort of thinking about limited diversity, whether or not this work is relevant, a lack of criticality anchoring the program, and then rigid and inflexible program structures. So, in terms of the first point, limited diversity of instructors, I touched on that before, and I think that it's a challenge, but there's also just so much possibility, because I think part of it is about expanding who we think deserves to teach our children. And for so long, I think the narrative of best and brightest has dominated the discourse, and not necessarily kind of local, non-traditional, culturally and linguistic folks kind of coming to this work. And what I think is really interesting about kind of this current shift of thinking very much about ethno-racial, cultural, linguistic diversity is the ways in which those students actually challenge our program structures, right? So just by the very nature of shifting who it is that we're preparing, I think in many ways it will force us to be much more culturally responsive in our preparation. The other thing is thinking about relevance and responsivity in schools, to schools, children, and communities. And I think I want to share this example. It's listed under the challenges because one of the premier teacher education scholars for many, many years, Ken Zeichner, over the last couple of years, published some work that they were doing around kind of community-based teacher education, and in particular thinking about how to identify community leaders and partners to kind of work in the preparation of teacher candidates. And so in this particular case for that pilot program, they actually were having community leaders serve as mentors in that work. So, teacher candidates were actually partner with community mentors to learn a little bit more about their perspectives on students in schools and what they thought some of the educational issues were. And one of the things that really sort of came up in that work, which is not necessarily surprising, but I think important to note as a challenge, is the tension between kind of power and, who thinks they kind of own the knowledge of what teachers need to know and be able to do. And what it means whenever we expand teacher educator to mean not just university, but community kind of in school base, and how expertise is affirmed outside the power constructs of whether or not someone works at a university or not. And sort of what they kind of found kind of in that work is unless we're really sort of intentional about a collective understanding of preparing teachers in ways that are responsive, which, means in some ways that some teacher educators have to sort of, expand notions of expertise beyond the way that they traditionally see it, it's very difficult to bring in those community-based leaders, and therefore continues to exacerbate this issue of not necessarily being relevant. The next point in terms of thinking about lack of criticality and anchoring programs, I think is clear kind of and straightforward. I tried to show that on the second slide that I showed, which is really sort of thinking about this notion of culturally efficacious dimensions, and how, with the work of Dr. Belinda Bucés Flores at the University of Texas, San Antonio, that framework anchored the entire program. It wasn't like a side pet research project. That was the foundation. Kind of in their educator preparation program, they were tasked to develop culturally efficacious teachers. This is the framework that they used, and that framework actually, extended all the way through the kind of observation protocols that they used. And then finally, the last point, rigid and inflexible program structures. That in some ways is connected to the first point about limited diversity. So, whenever we think about education preparation programs traditionally being for white middle-class females who are kind of going through our programs in 4 to 5 years and who are going to school full-time, our current structure really makes sense in terms of the times that we offer courses, what we think is kind of appropriate community learning experiences. But if you start to shift who it is that we think is coming through our program, and don't misunderstand me, I'm definitely not saying that we sort of lower standards, right? But it's really sort of thinking about how do we kind of make sure that our structures are more fluid so that there's opportunity for everybody who wants to become an educator, in particular, culturally and linguistically diverse educators. And so these are challenges, but in introducing them, I also tried to say ways that we might think about addressing them as well. And so finally, thinking about key takeaways, advancing culturally responsive preparation. I don't think that these are surprising. These principles, my colleagues and I, we talk about this in our chapter on culturally responsive teacher education. We try to sort of end the chapter talking about these principles. And I guess I would say that these principles are kind of like ground zero. So this is sort of like, that your program is not doing this work, or that that, colleagues that you like to partner with are not doing this work. And these are kind of some of the basic principles to begin thinking about, should you really want to take seriously this idea of culturally responsive preparation. And so the first is thinking about this principle of pre-service teachers' critical openness and reflection. So the question here is, how are teachers encouraged to engage in critical openness and reflection? And not just in the context of one class, but throughout their entire preparation program. And then I guess kind of more importantly, how is that being assessed? And so work that I have gone to early on has been by the late Peter Morrell, who has a book out of Harvard Ed Press, along with some other colleagues, talking about how to go about nurturing and kind of really identifying and nurturing the dispositions of teachers. And I think that's important because there are a lot of different activities that we could actually do. But at the end of the day, we also need assessment protocols to really see if that work is moving the needle. Is this work kind of deepening the critical consciousness of our teachers? And do we have sort of an end in mind? What are those set of dispositions that we definitely expect teacher candidates to be able to exhibit? And I think that his framework is really, really useful for that. The second principle is thinking about administrator and faculty culturally responsive commitments. So how are administrators and faculty selected, evaluated, or rewarded for their culturally responsive commitments? And so in this particular case, and I'll just talk about it from kind of a faculty perspective for a second, we all have our kind of annual evaluations that sort of talk about, how we're doing in terms of our teaching and engagement with teacher candidates. But where is sort of culturally responsive pedagogy in that, valued in that evaluation process? On the one hand, it should be connected to whether or not we're actually engaging in culturally responsive practices with our teacher candidates, and kind of how that shows up in the context of our work with teacher candidates of color in particular. And that's actually a topic that really got me interested in this work from the very beginning, is that, what does it mean for a teacher educator to actually be culturally responsive? What are the dimensions of that? And if we were to sort of be reflective, how would we sort of assess in terms of our own practice whether or not we're actually being culturally responsive in our work? And then the other thing, again, as I mentioned before, is also thinking about bringing in people who actually value culturally responsive commitments, not just as a kind of I like diversity and it's interesting, but bring a critical perspective that actually would kind of push the program and move it further along. The third principle is thinking about culturally responsive clinical experiences. how are pre-service teachers supported and held accountable for implementing culturally responsive practices in schools? And so, you know, I think that all of this work, we can kind of like talk about it, but how do we make sense of it in practice? And to be honest, most of the programs that I think do really strong work, like the University of Texas, San Antonio, the California Mini Corps program, GYO, Illinois, some folks out of the University of San Francisco, people who are kind of doing that program, it's not like they have this kind of one perfect model where they have everything figured out, but they've made the commitment that they are going to kind of push themselves through iterative refinement in clinical practices to figure out how they can make sure that they're doing the best that they can to prepare teachers to be culturally responsive. And in the example that I used from UTSA in terms of the culturally efficacious observation protocol, that's an example of taking a framework. It wasn't like, you know, she had someone else that she was kind of drawing on at that time. She used the theoretical, the research that was undergirding the importance of culturally responsive pedagogy, and she used it to shape that framework. And that framework then not just influenced you know, what was happening in terms of discussions in the teacher education classroom, that also influenced the kind of feedback that teachers received in schools, and it also influenced the kinds of things that school-based teacher educators were looking at, which also influenced their practice. And it becomes a space where culturally responsive clinical experiences are not just about preparing the teacher candidate, but it's also a way of pushing the commitment of all of the teacher educators who are involved in the process and the schools in which the teacher candidates are situated, right? Because as the teachers begin to see the importance and affirmation of this practice, this observation tools becomes a source of dialogue with them around how to take up culturally efficacious work. And then finally, the last principle, integration of culturally responsive pedagogy in the program. And so I think I've kind of made this point, which is how is culturally responsive pedagogy integrated into all preparation, coursework, curriculum, and instruction? So really sort of thinking about the integration, not just in the context of one individual class, but thinking about it throughout the entire program. And so this brings us to the very last slide, which is really connected to your action plans, which is around supporting culturally responsive preparation, critical questions for action. And I hope that that kind of part of what I've shared has kind of caused you to think a little bit about what might I do differently in terms of my work with schools and districts. So how might you work with educator preparation programs to support your current and new teacher workforce in implementing culturally responsive pedagogies? Right, what might those partnerships look like? What opportunities and challenges might emerge as a result of pursuing culturally responsive preparation for all teacher candidates? And then finally, what other organizations in your community might provide support to help new and continuing teachers improve culturally responsive pedagogy in schools? And I'll just give one example of the very last point. I had an opportunity to work with some folks in San Antonio who are connected to the UTSA program and the Institute of Texan Cultures, which is a museum there, and a group of teachers in service and pre-service who were just interested in learning more about culturally responsive pedagogy. And so we started, you know, doing a book study on this idea of culturally efficacious praxis, and what happened kind of in this conversation, and this is kind of an organic partnership, the teachers really became interested in how they would infuse these ideas into kind of unit of study. And so we developed a partnership with the museum, in this case as the Institute of Texan Cultures, to develop these kind of culturally efficacious units of study that teachers will be implementing this fall into the spring, and they will actually be featured as a museum exhibit in downtown San Antonio. And so I share that to say that, you know, through this partnership with the museum, the teachers have access to resources they didn't necessarily otherwise have and can push themselves in terms of taking up culturally efficacious practices. And also the students are, you know, having an opportunity to talk about really juicy and compelling topics around critical social justice work that they didn't necessarily have access to. Because part of the work of, you know, what's taking place in those units of study is thinking about critical action research projects that they would take up. So I just offer that as kind of one example of how this idea could actually come to life through a partnership with the museum or a local community-based organization. And I think that we're right at time. So now I'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, thanks. That was wonderful. We have some questions coming in. I'm just going to remind folks that you can submit your questions. And Conrad, we're going to start with one that's hopefully an easy one, but one that I think somebody would like the answer to, so it's a quick one. Could you provide the name of the scholar who focuses on the community teacher? Again, it sounds like you mentioned someone who focuses on the community teacher.
Yeah. So I said the late Peter Morrell. He has a book. The book is actually called The Community Teacher, A New Framework for Effective Urban Teaching.
Great. Thanks. Okay. The next question is the following. If we're honest, there are some learners who may not be able or willing to grow in terms of cultural respect and culturally responsive dispositions and behaviors. Where does this fit into the key principles you presented?
Yeah, oh, I love that. Yeah, so it fits. It fits. I mean, I think that, yeah, if we're honest, that's right. So one of the, I think that this really kind of comes in terms of program structure. It's more like kind of thinking about the components of our program. So thinking about who we actually admit into our program. I think that part of, our program is really, at least in a traditional sense, are really designed, like I mentioned before, for white, female, middle-class teacher candidates. But one of the things I've been challenging my colleagues to think about is to make sure that we're not necessarily just thinking about, oh, this is who we're working with, but really the question is, are we bringing in folks who have a critical disposition to work with communities of color? And if we are saying that we value this as a disposition and as an exit marker of being able to, leave our program is being able to exhibit this kind of culturally responsive practice, then it seems to me that we should be thinking more about, not as like an ignorance of, but more about how in our selection and recruitment practices, we're recruiting folks who already have a type of critical disposition. I was talking with some of my STEM colleagues who were trying to think about this idea of CRP in STEM, and one of the things that we are piloting is how in our selection model we may ask a series of questions that are about critical consciousness, because we recognize that kind of ultimately that's a key component in terms of being able to do this work. And that we're really sort of focusing on bringing people who sort of already have kind of a disposition leaning in that direction, because, as you say, if we're honest, there has to be some willingness to kind of take up this kind of critical perspective. And so to me, part of the way of getting around that, so to speak, is to think about the importance of bringing in people who have that type of critical perspective. And we do that by thinking about how we create opportunities and pathways to folks who have traditionally been denied access to the profession. And so and in fact, that's one of the reasons why I've become very interested in Grow Your Own programs, not as the solution, but as one of the solutions to ensure that we bring in folks who are more likely to take up these kind of critical competencies. And the other way that I would answer that is to say that we, regardless of who we have entering our programs, there should be some kind of, framework for thinking about dispositions. So the same scholar that I just mentioned, Peter Morrell, and I can't say the exact title of the book, but if you were to look up Harvard Ed Press, it's Dispositions for Teacher Candidates, something along those lines. One of the things that he does with his colleagues, it's an edited volume, is that there are sort of different chapters for kind of how programs have thought about measuring teacher dispositions. And if teachers are not able to exhibit certain dispositions at a particular point, they're encouraged to be counseled out of the program. And so kind of part of that work is not just like, as long as they don't say anything completely ridiculous about students, we're just going to allow them to move through. But it's really thinking about critical, hard questions that we might kind of ask students to consider, where we can really see how their belief systems come to life. And based on those kinds of questions and looking at development over time, you use that as a potential instrument as to whether or not you kind of keep someone in the program or think about counseling them out. And I will say that finally, in answering the question, I know that is not the norm, but it is, I think, the work that needs to be done, is kind of having those kinds of conversations with our colleagues about where our values lie in terms of the kind of folks we want coming through our program, and what is it that we might need to do differently to address some of those issues.
Great, thanks. Next question, we're going to switch a little bit to, you did talk about some programs that are sort of exemplars in this area, but certainly many programs maybe still need to move in this direction. So the question is, how might districts actually work with their local educator preparation programs to improve their culturally responsive training if they're not already prioritizing this?
Yeah, I like that. District partnerships. So a program that I think it's transformed into something something else now, but originally it was called Teach Tomorrow Oakland. And this particular program really started from within the Oakland Unified School District, who was kind of really concerned about making sure that there were kind of culturally responsive educators. And so it formulated as an alt-cert program originally, but then transitioned into more a traditional program. But so what matters here is, one, that the district recognized that the caliber of teachers that they were receiving, in particular as it related to CRP and ethno-racial diversity, were not where they wanted it to be. And so they engaged the university in conversation to think about what they might do differently. Now, what the partnership looked like that I think is really interesting is that for their selection model, and this is what I'm saying that is important in terms of kind of innovation, is that in a traditional educator preparation program, the selection of the teacher candidates who matriculate through the program really is owned by the ed prep program, and the faculty are doing that work. But in this particular model, teachers were not only, potential teachers were not only recommended for the community, but whenever they had to do their teaching samples that you typically have to do, that teaching example, number one, was kind of based specifically in the school district. And the people who were observing and giving feedback were not just the teaching faculty, but there were also teachers from that particular school district, parents, and students. And so when they made decisions about who was being admitted into the program for further, preparation to become teachers, it was actually a collaborative conversation about what was actually being valued across that community of practitioners. So it wasn't just the teacher-educator voice that was sort of overpowering the conversation, but there were sort of school leaders involved in that work. And the part that I think is really kind of innovative is that community members and students were part of that process as well. And so I think, I know, from my own perspective, being at UH, that, if a university is really committed to CRP and wants to remain kind of relevant and not outdated, partnerships with districts are exactly what we want. And I think also another place, especially for research intensive institutions who are really sort of committed to, grant funding and so on, is from a district perspective is saying, hey, I know that you want to kind of partner around these different kind of, research grants in terms of, lifting your own profile at the university level, but we're not really going to engage in any kind of partnerships that don't center CRP or culturally sustaining work as like a fundamental work in our district. I think that districts have significantly more power than what they realize. And I guess the last point I'll add to that is that, districts can also operate, and this is extreme, especially if you don't have the capacity and resources, but the school districts can also offer as kind of their own alternative certification preparation programs. And I say that not because I think that we shouldn't have traditional educator preparation programs, and I don't see the value of them, because I do, and I'm employed in one. But I offer that because, to me, what it signals is that it shouldn't be that the districts feel like they don't have a voice in what's happening with the development of teachers. And in having that kind of leverage to do that sort of work, and they may say, hey, we have this ridiculous teacher shortage, attrition problem that will not go away. We want to develop this structure for alternative, but we can't do it without making sure that we have folks who are experts from traditional programs working, preparing, and pushing these folks, making sure that we kind of admit people who are culturally responsive. And so a partnership could be formed in that way that's driven by the district needs, but also draws upon the CRP expertise from the educator preparation program. And I share that as an example because that's something that we're actually pursuing currently at my university.
Great. Conrad, the next question, we might have time for one or two more, we'll see. But you mentioned a couple programs, but the question is, are there university education programs and or teacher residencies who excel in this model? Can you just talk about where there are some exemplars here?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the residency programs in general, in my mind, excel because it's about kind of doing a lot of the teaching and learning as like kind of based and grounded in schools. So that kind of the residency is taking place in schools with mentor teachers who are doing kind of with mentor teachers and having teacher educators who come from that school community. So that's really kind of responsive and embedded in the school context. Early on, I think that the Boston Teacher Residency Program was really a premier leader in that work. The University of Chicago Teacher Residency Program has been, I think, doing exceptional work for some time. I know that there is, and I'm kind of talking at a national level, and I'm talking as a residency from the understanding of these types of graduate residency programs where folks already have undergraduate degrees and then are sort of going into teaching by getting their master's degree grounded in school context. But I also know that at the national level, in terms of the residency model, that there's a particular commitment on ethno-racial diversity, and I saw that they recently awarded a partnership with residing programs in the state of Tennessee to really think about doing this kind of critical education work. I would also say, I haven't mentioned this yet, that there is a group called Brandt's Alliance for Educator Diversity, and they sort of have a collective of universities that they're working with to take up this idea of, you know, what it means to prepare culturally responsive educators. And I think that group in and of itself is a resource of, you know, probably like 10 or 15 other universities who are really committed in unpacking this work. And what they do, which I do think is something important to consider, is they use the framework of minority serving institutions and thinking about the way that they approach working with teacher candidates and the kind of experiences, the clinical experiences that they offer students as a way to kind of redefine how we approach culturally responsive pedagogy in traditional teacher education. And so they have an approach that's very much kind of, you know, practice-based. It's about operating within a community of learners and driven by data. And so I think that as a collective, that would be a really interesting group to explore should you be interested in partnering with other universities committed to CRP.
Great, thank you so much. Conrad, I probably won't pose any more questions for you now because we're just about out of time, but there are a number of questions related to some of the, you know, the tools or the resources that you've mentioned throughout the webinar. So I think what we'd like to do is, after this webinar, maybe put together a resource list for folks and send that out. Would that be okay?
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
That we'll do. Okay. So we will circulate something because I know there's been a lot of really rich information here, and you've pointed folks to other resources. So we'll put that together and circulate that. But at this point, I'm going to draw things to a close. And first and foremost, thank you, Conrad, for today's webinar and fielding these various questions. I want to again encourage the audience to take the action plan with you. It has the questions that were posed at the end of the webinar on it, and a prompt and space to start developing your own responses. So have this be the beginning of your own action plan around CRP and educator preparation. And lastly, I want to thank everyone for joining us, both for today's webinar and any previous webinars you might have been able to join. Please look for information about upcoming REL events on our website. This includes a webinar coming up in November on chronic absenteeism in the early grades. We don't have a date set for that yet, so look for an invitation coming soon. And that is going to conclude things. Brian, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. As a reminder, the on-demand recording will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast using the same audience link you used to join today's event. The recording and a transcript will be posted on the REL Mid-Atlantic website in the coming weeks. Don't forget to fill out the survey and hit submit. Thank you and have a great afternoon. This concludes today's webinar.